Joe Louis once hit a man so hard that he spun in a full circle. And like most of the extraordinary feats he achieved during his incredible career, he accomplished this KO through use of his otherworldly, extraordinary, near superhuman intelligence. When most think of Joe Louis, they think of his effortless power, and this makes complete sense. 52 of his 66 victories were knockouts, and he could topple men as big or bigger than today's heavyweight champions with ease. And good thing too, because he faced a number of these giants during his 25 championship defenses over a nearly 12-year reign. In case you haven't noticed, Louis had knockout power in both hands with every kind of strike, including jabs. And while I made an entire video on his legendary cross, his hooks and uppercuts were equally devastating. What's more, his power did not wane in the least during his lightning-fast combinations. While each punch beautifully set up the next, no punch was a throwaway. Power was not sacrificed for speed because so much of Louis's power came from his speed, combined with perfect form. Louis was meticulous about punching with the best form possible, particularly after his loss to Max Schmeling, where Schmeling won by exploiting a flaw in Louis's jab. Louis's dominant victory during the rematch is a great example of just how easily Louis could adjust and adapt, because Louis's punching prowess would have been nothing without the mind behind it. And I hope to illustrate in this video why I believe that Joe Louis was the smartest offensive boxer ever, and maybe even the smartest fighter of all time, period. And the rematch against Max Schmeling actually showcases Louis's unique form of offensive genius perfectly. Before the first fight, Schmeling had noticed that Louis had pawed with his jab, which was usually a boon for Louis. But Schmeling timed the opening and put Louis down with a tremendous right. In their second fight, Louis corrected this form, drawing his jab straight back to his shoulder. But he was also simply far more aggressive. Louis pinned Schmeling's back hand, keeping his head safe while negating Schmeling's ability to throw his right at all. After doing this, he would move in close, where he still had incredible fight-stopping power, but Schmeling lacked the ability to throw his best punch. Louis didn't only use his jab, but also his lead hook to pin the guard before safely moving inside. Which brings us to the second and most important piece of Louis's brilliance: his ability to adjust angles to find openings in a nanosecond. With Schmeling's back against the ropes, Louis targeted his chin with an uppercut in response to him protecting his jaw and temple with a rear crossblock. He next targeted Schmeling's jaw with the lead hook when Schmeling adjusted to protect his chin. Louis missed a cross, but again adjusted mid-movement to sidestep, creating a new angle to straighten his lead hook and send it inside of Schmeling's guard. It should be clear that aside from his tactical genius, there are few, if anyone, who is ever as good at adjusting in real time as Joe Louis. If he were a stand-up comedian, he would be the kind who could improvise on the spot, shutting down any hecklers with the savage brutality of Bill Burr. After the first knockdown, Schmeling was ironically brought down by Louis's new jab, Louis occupying his rear hand to set up his own thunderous right. When it came to adjusting to capitalize on opening, Joe Louis seemed to think at superhuman speeds. Of course, he was also equally as adept at creating these defensive holes himself. He was a master of draw and counter, and you can check out my earlier video on his cross to see how he set it up by drawing an opponent's jab with his own. But he also had a number of subtle traps and guard manipulations that would make Lomachenko nod in approval, and a number of posture manipulations that would make George Foreman stop grilling and take notes. And the one thread that stitched all of Louis's offense together was his ability to always find the simplest, most forward solutions to even the most complex problems. Like a general looking over the whirling chaos of troops on a battlefield and finding the one critical point to counterattack and break the enemy line.
Most boxers need a feel-out round. Lewis needed a feel-out exchange. Oftentimes, an opponent had to do something wrong only once. For example, in this fight, Lewis was defending his title against a top 10 contender. But within the first round, Lewis noticed that his opponent dropped his rear hand as he moved in to attack. So, Lewis punished him with one of the tightest, shortest punches I've ever seen, knocking him to the canvas by moving his fist no more than a few inches, stunning him, driving him to the ropes, and finishing the fight. All Lewis really needed to do this was to pick up on a single tendency, not even necessarily a mistake. Here's another example from the first exchange of another fight. Lewis notices that his opponent blocks across with a leverage block, so Lewis immediately steps to the left and throws a straighter cross, getting inside of his competitor's arm. Without missing a beat, he follows up with an uppercut. Overwhelmed by the pressure, the opponent takes a knee. But it's too late. The fight is already over because Lewis has already found a path to victory. Each time his opponent extended his arm and tried to establish a collar tie, either a tight straight or rear uppercut would follow. And in this last example, Lewis again uses his opponent's defense against him. When the opponent crouches, Lewis immediately targets his kidney. Lewis would frame against his head to trap him, leading him into an uppercut or driving a hard right into his kidney. You may remember this technique from the last video on Mike McCallum, and it worked just as well then as it does now. After rounds of punishment, the fight was called off after the fifth. And the Brown Bomber was the same way with his defense, not only adjusting immediately, but finding a way to counter as well. Like Floyd Mayweather, Lewis would usually only get caught with the same shot once. Of course, Lewis was far more aggressive and competing at heavyweight, so when he did get tagged, it was a big deal. For instance, in this fight against the #1 ranked contender at the time, Lewis falls prey to the classic lead hook right straight. The hook widening Lewis's guard so the straight can go through the new opening. Lewis crashed into the ropes, but he adjusted right away. Seconds later, when his opponent tried another right, Lewis straightened his arm to leverage block, then guided his head into a hard rear hook. He piled on, scoring a knockdown moments after being hurt. And he once again used that exact same defense to end the fight, taking out the #1 ranked contender in the first round. Now let's take a look at how he fared against a more noteworthy competitor, the Great X champion Max Baer, to get an idea of how he executed game plans over the course of longer fights. This one comes with a pretty spectacular finish. It's important to note that Baer was one of the hardest punchers of all time. And he'd only been defeated by the Cinderella Man, James Braddock, because Braddock had perfectly executed a genius, albeit cautious, approach to the fight. But Lewis would take a much more aggressive approach. While Braddock circled outside, away from Baer's cross, Lewis slowly closed the distance. And while Braddock had backed away from Baer's probing lead hand, which he liked to use to frame and set up shots, Lewis used it to his advantage, bumping and pairing his fist up to create space to land shots. And whereas Braddock had moved inside to stifle Baer's cross, Lewis preferred to roll and counter.
or just take away the possibility altogether with a hard, stiff jab. And note that I'm not criticizing Braddock here. He pulled off a genius game plan. But unlike Braddock, Joe Louis had the ability to finish the fight. Baer's go-to when it came to defense was a cross guard. But as soon as he used it, Louis started picking holes immediately, taking advantage of the gap in the side of Baer's raised rear crossblock. The moment that Baer raised one of his elbows, Louis would target his vulnerable sides. Louis even made openings himself, pulling down Baer's guard as he desperately tried to defend. A critical point in the fight was when Baer threw one of his signature berserk-like barrages at Louis, and Louis, instead of backing down, responded in kind, actually winning the exchange by merit of having the tighter, cleaner punches. Not only did Louis knock Baer out, he did so being the aggressor against one of the most terrifying punchers of all time. Now, let's finish off the video by looking at a few fights that were a bit more difficult, to showcase how Louis could stay calm and adjust even when under insane pressure, and to show off how much heart he had when facing adversity. Here Louis is up against a grappler who doesn't let him have an inch of space, swarming him from the clinch. Louis was taking more shots than he could give, and stepping back to uppercut rarely worked. His opponent was too good at slipping. But then, in round 6, Louis finally figured out the solution. Rather than grapple or step back to create space, Louis moved laterally, sidestepping to create the distance necessary to land tight hooks. As always, once he figured out the solution, he did not stop exploiting his opponent's weakness. After 3 knockdowns, the fight was stopped. But that didn't stop Louis's bitter opponent from rushing him anyways. I'm getting the feeling that Louis wasn't too worried though. Now, on to the finale. In this case, I've saved the best for last. In this fight, Louis was fighting none other than Max Baer's brother, the 6'7" elite boxer, Buddy Baer. Early in the fight, Louis got caught with a lead hook that sent him tumbling through the ropes. However, as was the custom, he was never caught with that same shot again. First, Louis slipped inside to ride the punch, loading up a hard lead hook of his own. Buddy's mouthpiece went flying. The next round, Louis ducked underneath, returning the same hard lead hook counter. Now Buddy was hurt, and Louis started to pile on. Buddy was just as tough as his brother. However, he didn't seem to understand that no matter how many times he threw the lead hook, the shot would never work again. After several brutal rounds, Louis hit home with the fight-ending punch. And this is the shot that spun Buddy Baer 360 degrees until he rested unconscious on the canvas. And that's why I think it's high time that people realize the true genius of the Brown Bomber, the great Joe Louis. If you'd like to learn some of these tactics yourself, you can check out my books on power, defense, and footwork. Link below. From the Modern Martial Artist, this has been David Christian, wishing you happy training.